I'm just going to come back to some questions on fleecehold, if that's all right. I know you sort of mentioned some of these points in the previous responses. At the time of the King's Speech, policy papers said that the draft bill would bring the injustice of fleecehold private estates and unfair costs to an end. It's fair to say this piece of legislation probably doesn't do that, and I think you've laid out reasonable reasons why it's going to be covered elsewhere. What commitment, approaching the question I may ask previously from a slightly different angle, what commitment would you now like to make to fleecehold people in my constituency who are in these fleecehold properties in terms of when the government and how the government will address their concerns?
We do want to address their concerns and the injustices that many of them face. We've looked at, in the development of this draft bill, what specific provisions we can bring forward, and obviously have brought some forward, so the bill is not silent on private estates, on freehold estates. Rent charges provisions are in there. But we're taking forward, as you know, publication of 2 consultations late last year, both on switching on those consumer protection provisions that are in the 2024 Act, and the more thorny issue, if you like, of how we reduce the prevalence of these estates over time. I see the sort of approach of the government to freehold as a sort of 3-legged stool. You've got those immediate consumer protections that we can switch on fairly quickly, although again we're establishing a new regulatory framework, so it's not an overnight thing. Then there's this sort of very important issue of control, which the Law Commission's work is exploring. There were debates in the last Parliament about whether you could just copy and paste a right to manage over for freehold estates. It's not quite as simple as that. So again, we've asked the Law Commission to look at what's the best answer, and then getting at the prevalence issue over time, which is more challenging, and there are trade-offs that that consultation engages with. But again, it will be something that we will deal with in this Parliament as part of those wider manifesto commitments.
Are you reasonably confident that further changes, that there is going to be more primary legislation that is required to make the changes that are necessary in order to make that commitment to bring the injustice of fleecehold private estates and unfair costs to an end?
I don't think I can sit here and make that commitment now. I think partly we need to see, particularly on the prevalence issue, what comes out of the consultation.
Okay. In terms of timings, are you broadly thinking you're going to wait for the next round of Law Commission work to come back, then make a decision on what further legislation is required, then put that legislation forward?
I think this is all, Mr. Curtis, if you sort of excuse me, extremely hypothetical. We've got 2 consultations that we got a significant amount of feedback to. Then we've got the Law Commission work on whether there is and what it would be an appropriate form of enhanced residential freeholder control of freehold estates. I think we've got to see what comes out of that before I can say to you, yes, it definitely needs legislation or it doesn't.
I think there's some concern among some people we speak to about whether moving forward with that process that you set out, that I set out and you maybe agreed with, of waiting for the Law Commission to come back and then moving forward with possible legislation off the back of that would then push us into the next Parliament. So I suppose what I'm trying to get at is whether you think there is a risk of that happening, and whether you think therefore we should be considering what we can do in this, given it's unlikely we're going to get to that. There is an argument it's unlikely we're going to get to that otherwise in Parliament.
Bring officials in it. I don't think I can answer that sitting here today. I don't know what the Law Commission are going to say. That is their recommended approach on this point. It, I suppose, comes back to what you mean by the end of the injustice of fleecehold. I would say that at the point we have switched on new consumer protections, that we're taking action, because we will take action to reduce the prevalence of private estates, and it will happen in this Parliament. But let's see what comes out of that. We will have honoured our manifesto commitment in that respect. But it depends what you think the solution is. I mean, you can tell me and I can tell you my view on it.
Well, I think, at the very least, setting up a regulator for managing agents is something I think we all broadly agree on. I don't think there's really any argument that should be done at some point. And if that requires primary legislation, and that primary legislation isn't going to come until the Law Commission has come back, and there's a chance that goes into the next Parliament, then
really
there is an
conflating
argument.
a number of quite distinct issues. We've got managing agent reform, which the Lord Best 2019 report has dealt with. We've got a Law Commission piece of work on right to manage or what the variant of right to manage might.
A big part of the problems the injustice of what's happening on leasehold estates is because of the behaviour of managing agents acting in an unregulated way.
I agree, and I'd refer you to my previous answers on managing agents, where we're very clear we're going to deal with that.
If this committee decides that there is a chance that new primary legislation wouldn't come forward in this Parliament, do you think it is reasonable to argue for that regulation of managing agents to be included in this legislation to help those on private leasehold estates?
We will strengthen the regulation of managing agents in this Parliament. If that requires primary legislation or inclusion in this bill, that's what we'll do.
Okay. Thank you for the clarity on that, Minister.